I never thought my life was interesting enough to share on a forum like this. But after what happened, it feels less like a choice and more like a confession. I'm a financial analyst, a job as predictable as it sounds. Spreadsheets, targets, rinse, repeat. Most days, I felt like a cog in a machine, running on autopilot. Harmless monotony, I told myself. But it wore me down in ways I didn't fully realize. That's probably why, during a lunch break with coworkers, a random mention of the dark web caught my attention. It wasn't a serious discussion, just conspiracy theory banter, but it planted a seed. That night, restless and curious, I Googled it. How to access the dark web. It was shockingly easy. A bit of patience, a downloaded browser, and a few tutorials later, I was there. At first, it felt underwhelming. I expected something sinister, but most of it was dull. Forums, marketplaces, people hawking bizarre junk like old fossils or antique coins. But then I found something more intriguing. Classified information for sale, exclusive corporate data, crypto market manipulation secrets. It sounded absurd, but also tantalizing. My rational side knew better, but a part of me craved the thrill. For once, something unpredictable. I don't know why I did it, but I bought one of the packages. It was easy. Too easy. A few clicks, a cryptocurrency transfer, and within hours, a zipped file appeared in my inbox. When I opened it, my stomach tightened. It was junk. Nonsensical spreadsheets, graphs that meant nothing. Shame hit me first, then frustration. How could I be so stupid? I almost forgot about it until my phone rang that night. It was 2 a.m. The number was blocked. When I answered, all I heard was breathing, deep, deliberate, too controlled to be a prank. I hung up, unsettled, but convinced myself it was random, a glitch, nothing to worry about. The next morning, I was proven wrong. An email sat in my inbox. The subject line read, "You thought that was it." The body was worse. We're watching. Attached was a photo of me leaving work the day before, taken from across the street. My chest felt tight. How did they know it was me? I'd used a pseudonym, an encrypted account. None of it should have been traceable. The messages kept coming. They knew my schedule, where I went, even small details no one should know. Each email was a needle, driving deeper into my skin. The breaking point came when I found an envelope taped to my apartment door. Inside was a single piece of paper. "Last chance," it said, alongside a photo of me standing on my balcony, taken from close, too close. That night, I didn't sleep. The silence in my apartment felt alive, pressing against my chest. Every creak of the building became a threat. Every shadow on the wall a figure waiting to strike. I sat by the window, staring out into the dark. If they were out there, I couldn't see them. But I could feel them. And somehow, that was worse. The next morning, I caved. They'd sent me a cryptocurrency account to transfer money, far more than what I'd paid for the data. My hands shook as I made the payment. I told myself it would end here, that once they got the money, they'd leave me alone. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't true. A few hours later, another message arrived. "You think that's enough? Now, we decide when it ends." My stomach clenched. They weren't asking for money anymore. The tone had changed. "You need to pay for going where you don't belong," the next email said. The words burrowed under my skin like a parasite. They had broken me, and they knew it. Desperation pushed me to the police. Explaining what happened felt like stripping my shame bare. every word a reminder of how I'd let this spiral out of control. To my surprise, they took it seriously, connecting me with a specialized team. But their explanation was grim. Dark web operations aren't straightforward to track, one officer said. Even with your cooperation, this could take months, maybe years. I left feeling no safer than before. That night, every creak of my apartment felt amplified, each one a warning. I kept all the lights on, but the shadows seemed deeper, denser, like they were waiting. Sleep didn't come. Only hours of staring at the locked door, straining to hear something, anything, on the other side. The next few weeks were relentless. The messages became more specific, more invasive. Once, while riding the subway, I got a text. "We like your new route." Another time, at my desk, an email arrived with a photo of me sitting there just minutes earlier. My heart felt like it was caving in. How were they this close? How could they know so much? Paranoia tightened around me like a noose. At work, I avoided everyone. At home, I avoided the mirrors, afraid of what might be watching me back. One evening, after a long meeting, I stepped into the office parking lot. My phone buzzed. "Look behind you." My breath hitched. For seconds that felt like hours, I couldn't move. Finally, I turned, muscles taut with dread. The parking lot was empty, just rows of cars under flickering lights. But it didn't feel empty. I rushed to my car, locking the doors with trembling hands, and drove. Not home, just anywhere. I drove until exhaustion forced me to stop, but the fear stayed with me, as if they'd planted it in my mind and let it grow roots. I decided to work more closely with the police. They started monitoring my communications, trying to trace the messages. For a while, I clung to the illusion of safety, as if someone watching over me meant I couldn't be touched. That illusion shattered when I found a piece of paper slipped under my apartment door. "Do you think they can protect you?" My fingers went numb holding it. Whoever they were, they had control, and they wanted me to know it. The breaking point came on a day that started almost normally. At work, I received an email. No text, just an attachment. Without thinking, I opened it. The image froze my blood. It was a recording from my computer's webcam. There I was, sitting on my couch the night before, head in my hands, defeated. They'd been watching me. How long? Weeks? Months? The thought made my skin crawl. I unplugged everything that night. My phone, my computer, even my internet. I sat in silence, convinced that if I disconnected, I could starve them of their power. But the silence became its own kind of torment, pressing against my ears. Then just after midnight, I heard it. 3 faint knocks on my living room window. My breath caught. I live on the 5th floor. I didn't look. I couldn't. The knocking stopped after a while, but the fear stayed, spreading through me like ice. When dawn came, the messages were gone. No texts, no emails, nothing. For the first time in weeks, it was quiet. But it didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. Even now, I don't know if they're gone or just biding their time. They're a shadow I can't escape, lurking at the edges of my life. Every knock, every buzz of my phone brings it all back. The worst part is knowing I invited them in. Some doors should never be opened, because once you cross that threshold, the other side never really lets you go. I've never been one to share much online. My social media was as unremarkable as it gets. Private, a handful of posts for close friends, and a profile picture I hadn't changed in years. But a few months ago, my life upended itself. I ended a long-term relationship, quit a soul-sucking job, and suddenly had too much free time and nowhere to direct it. Restlessness took over, and I found myself craving something different. That's when I started exploring the dark web. I'm still not sure what drew me in. Boredom, curiosity, or some buried need to see what most people were too afraid to. The first time I accessed it, my hands were shaking. I half expected the FBI to burst through my door the moment I opened that browser. But after a few hours of clicking through shady forums, dead links, and overhyped conspiracies, it seemed less dangerous than I'd imagined. Bizarre, sure. Creepy, absolutely. But mostly underwhelming. Then I met Andrew. Andrew appeared in one of those anonymous chat rooms. He said he was American, though his phrasing was precise, almost formal, like someone who'd rehearsed what to say. He seemed to know everything about this hidden world, where to look, what to avoid, and which whispers to take seriously. At first, I was cautious. I've always been wary of strangers online, especially those who seem too eager to help. But Andrew had a way of putting me at ease. His tone was calm, patient, like a teacher guiding a curious student. He led me to forums I'd never have found on my own, sent me archives of defunct sites, and shared links to strange, forgotten corners of the internet. It felt like he was opening a door to another world. We started chatting daily. It wasn't long before I started to trust him. I told myself it was harmless, just an eccentric hobby, something to pass the time. That's what I kept telling myself, even as the things he showed me grew darker. Then came the night I wish I could forget. It was a Saturday, late. My apartment was dim, except for the bluish glow of my laptop. Andrew messaged me, a single line. "You'll want to see this." Beneath it, a link. I hesitated. Something about the way he phrased it gave me pause, but curiosity pushed me forward. I clicked the link. The page loaded to blackness, except for a small video window in the center. No description, no chat, nothing to hint at what I was looking at. The video started on its own, as though it had been waiting for me. At first, it was just a dimly lit room, bare walls, a concrete floor, and a faint mechanical hum in the background. The kind of place that makes you feel cold just looking at it. Then she appeared. A woman, tied to a chair, her arms wrenched behind her back. The light flickered just enough to show her face, cuts along her cheekbone, a dark bruise spreading across her temple. She wasn't screaming. She was crying softly, her shoulders trembling with each breath. It was that kind of crying that's worse than screaming, like she didn't even have the energy to hope anyone would help her. My chest tightened. I should have closed the window. Every part of me screamed to do it, but I couldn't. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, useless. I told myself it wasn't real. It had to be fake. People stage this kind of thing all the time, right? Before I could convince myself, a figure entered the frame. A man in a mask, tall and broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate. In his hand was a knife, long and gleaming in the faint light. He walked slowly, circling her like a predator. My pulse pounded in my ears as he began speaking. The sound was muffled, distant, but his tone was sharp, laced with anger. She started to squirm in the chair, her wrists straining against the ropes. Her muffled cries turned frantic, and my stomach twisted into a knot. I wanted to believe it was staged. My mind scrambled for excuses. The lighting's too perfect, the sound too crisp. But her eyes betrayed something raw, something no actor could fake. Why did Andrew send me this? The thought came too late. I couldn't focus on anything but the screen. My hands were clammy, my breath uneven. I felt sick, rooted in my chair like a prisoner to what was unfolding. I wanted answers, but there were none. The video wasn't going to explain itself. Andrew wasn't messaging me anymore. And in that moment, I realized how badly I had misjudged this world and the man who had led me into it. Suddenly, the masked figure stopped behind the woman, knife raised, and pressed the blade against her shoulder. The video's muffled audio shifted. A sound cut through it, high-pitched, desperate, and raw. A scream, not the kind from movies, carefully staged to send shivers down your spine. This was unfiltered, guttural, the kind of sound that claws at your nerves and won't let go. I froze, my vision blurred, my body stiff. It was as if my mind was rebelling, trying to shut down. I wanted to stop watching, close the browser, unplug the computer, anything, but my hands wouldn't move. All I managed to do, almost by instinct, was press the screenshot key before slamming the browser shut. The screen went black, but it didn't feel like I'd escaped. That sound, the scream, kept echoing in my head. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the blank screen. My room, once familiar, now felt suffocating. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my heart. I couldn't bring myself to turn off the computer or even move. My breath came shallow and quick, and my hands shook so violently I had to clench them into fists just to stop. Sleep was impossible. All night, I replayed the scene in my mind, analyzing every detail, searching for an explanation. Maybe it was fake, I told myself. A performance. A stunt. But deep down, I couldn't believe that. The woman's expression, the glint of the knife, the faint bruises on her arms. They were too vivid, too real. The next day, Andrew messaged me like nothing had happened. So, what did you think? His casual tone hit me like a slap. My mind raced. Did he know what I'd seen? Was he part of it? Worse, did he know where I lived? My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my stomach twisting. Finally, I typed something short, trying to sound unfazed. Man, what was that? It took him a while to respond. When he did, his reply was chillingly cryptic. Sometimes, it's better to just watch. Those words burrowed into my mind, turning over again and again. What did he mean? Was it a warning? A threat? I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every notification. By nightfall, I'd made up my mind. I deleted all my chats with Andrew, uninstalled the apps I used to access the dark web, and ran every antivirus program I could find. None of it made me feel any safer. I avoided my computer for days, but the images from the video stayed with me. The woman's eyes haunted me, the way they locked onto the camera, wide with fear, like she was silently begging for help. And Andrew's words, sometimes, it's better to just watch, echoed in the back of my mind. I hated myself for doing nothing, for sitting frozen in my chair while something unspeakable unfolded in front of me. Then Andrew sent something that shattered any illusion of safety. It was late, and my phone buzzed with a new message. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a photo of the woman from the video, still tied up, her face streaked with tears. But she was in a different room now. Bare walls, harsh fluorescent light, and a damp concrete floor. Beneath the photo was a single caption. Want to try saving her? My blood ran cold. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped my phone. This couldn't be happening. I deleted the photo immediately, but it didn't matter. The image was seared into my memory. I spent the entire night pacing, my thoughts spiraling. Call the police? What would I even tell them? I didn't have enough information. No names, no locations, just a sinking feeling that I'd crossed a line I couldn't come back from. And what if Andrew knew more about me than I realized? The possibility made my skin crawl. The next morning, another message arrived. No guts, huh? That's fine. I expected that. This time, I didn't respond. I couldn't. But the silence that followed was worse than his cryptic messages. Every notification, every creak of my apartment felt like a warning. I jumped at shadows, certain that someone was watching me. Days turned into weeks, and still, nothing happened. No news reports, no follow-up messages. It was as if the video had never existed. Slowly, life began to return to normal, but the experience left a scar. Even now, months later, I avoid my laptop, flinching at the faint glow of the screen. I still see her face sometimes, in the edges of my dreams, those terrified eyes that begged for help I couldn't give. And Andrew's final words still haunt me. Sometimes, it's better to just watch. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or why he targeted me. But one thing is certain. I'll never go near the dark web again. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. And some things, once seen, never let you go. I've always been Enrique, a biology student obsessed with genetics. From the moment I stepped into my first college lecture, I was hooked. DNA mapping, genetic modifications, the untapped potential of biotechnology. It all felt like science on the edge of magic. That obsession drove me to take on an ambitious independent project, simulate a complete genetic map using real human samples. With limited resources, it was practically impossible, but I saw it as a challenge, a way to stand out in academia. The real problem? Finding human samples to study. After weeks of fruitless research, I stumbled across the idea of the dark web. It felt like a leap into a world I barely understood, but desperation and curiosity pushed me forward. Setting up the tools to browse it felt like a ritual. Downloading software, configuring encryption, convincing myself I wasn't doing anything truly wrong. The first few nights were frustrating. The dark web was far less thrilling than I'd imagined. Just broken links, cryptic forums, and scattered rumors. But eventually, I found what I was looking for. A seller claiming to have discreetly sourced human DNA samples. He seemed professional, responding quickly to my questions, assuring me the samples were sterile and anonymous. The price was suspiciously low, but I ignored the red flags. All I could see was an opportunity. When the package arrived, I felt a strange mix of pride and apprehension. It was wrapped in plain black plastic with no sender information, just like the seller promised. Inside were several sterile tubes, exactly what I needed. But tucked alongside them was something I hadn't expected, a USB drive. My curiosity flared. Maybe it contained handling instructions or technical specifications, I thought. But when I opened it on my laptop, my stomach dropped. The drive was packed with files, personal information about the individuals whose DNA I now possessed. Names, addresses, birth dates, medical histories. It was all there, disturbingly detailed and painfully real. My breath caught as the weight of what I'd done crashed over me. This wasn't just an ethical misstep. It was a crime. How had this data been obtained? Did these people even know their most private information was being sold? For hours, I sat frozen in front of my computer, unable to close the files. My initial excitement had soured into something dark and suffocating. I felt complicit, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Every fiber of my being told me to delete everything, to pretend this had never happened, but my hands wouldn't move. The USB drive burned in my mind like a brand, a line I had crossed that I could never uncross. That night, I didn't sleep. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the weight of my guilt. Every creak of the building felt like a sign, every shadow a threat. The paranoia started to bleed into my everyday life. On campus, I avoided eye contact with classmates, convinced they could sense my unease. Notifications on my phone made me flinch. Every email felt like a trap, and the USB drive, along with the DNA samples, sat hidden in the back of a drawer like a ticking bomb. I thought about destroying everything, but what good would that do? The knowledge of what I'd seen couldn't be erased. And worse, what if someone was already tracking me? The seller, the authorities, the victims. It didn't matter who. The thought alone made my skin crawl. Every passing day felt heavier than the last, the paranoia growing like a virus in my mind. Finally, I decided to act. Late one night, I took the USB drive and the samples to an abandoned lot far from home. Under the dim glow of a streetlight, I doused the documents in alcohol and set them on fire. The flames licked at the tubes, sending up thick, acrid smoke that stung my eyes and throat. I stayed until there was nothing left but ash. As I watched the last embers fade, I felt a fleeting sense of relief, like I'd taken back some control. But the weight in my chest didn't lift. Destroying the evidence hadn't erased what I'd done. The knowledge was still there, and so was the fear. Back at home, the paranoia remained, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I kept imagining shadows moving outside my window, footsteps in the hallway, whispers just out of earshot. I knew it was irrational, but the line between reality and imagination felt thinner than ever. Months later, I still can't shake the feeling that someone is watching, waiting for me to slip up. I don't touch my computer anymore. Even the sight of a USB drive makes my stomach churn. What started as a naive pursuit of knowledge turned into something much darker. I wanted to push the boundaries of science, but instead, I found the boundaries of my own conscience. And now, I live with the unsettling truth. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some knowledge comes at too high a price. The days that followed were a suffocating mix of relief and constant fear. With the DNA samples and USB drive destroyed, I thought I could move on, but my mind refused to let me. At night, vivid nightmares took hold. Fragmented, surreal visions of faces I'd never seen, but somehow knew were tied to the data. In every dream, the faces blurred and distorted, their mouths opening as if to speak, but no sound came. Then, inevitably, the dreams would end the same way. A knock at my door, loud and insistent. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, convinced it was a sign that something was about to happen. The nights bled into days, and the paranoia tightened its grip. Every sound outside my apartment, footsteps in the hallway, the shuffle of mail, felt sharper, more threatening. My phone became a source of dread. Every notification made my chest tighten. Even at college, I avoided eye contact, kept conversations short, and skipped group projects, terrified someone would notice my growing anxiety. The weight of what I'd done clung to me, an invisible stain I couldn't wash away. Then, one night, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender was anonymous. The message was brief, but devastating. "Do you think this is enough?" The words hit me like a freight train. My stomach churned as questions swirled. Who had sent it? The seller? One of the victims? Someone entirely new? Or was it just my paranoia, twisting ordinary shadows into monsters? I stared at the screen for hours, torn between deleting the email and responding. In the end, fear won. I disconnected my computer from the internet, shoved it into the back of a closet, and swore never to use it again. But the damage was done. My attempt to fix my mistake had failed. I had stepped into dangerous territory, and now I was stuck, unable to move forward or undo the past. After that email, something shifted in me. Fear gave way to a deeper realization. I had lost control of the situation. Every stranger on the street seemed to look at me too long, their gaze heavy with unspoken knowledge. Every call from an unknown number felt like a trap. One night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, a chilling thought surfaced. What if someone had copied the data before I destroyed it? The seller could have backups, or worse, the files could already be spreading. Maybe the email was just the beginning, a warning. The thought consumed me. For the first time, I considered going to the police, but I knew my story would sound absurd. What if they dug into my transactions, my reputation, my career? It would all be over. Instead, I tried something desperate. I went back to the dark web, nerves frayed, hoping to find the seller. Each click felt like a step deeper into a trap, but I pushed forward, revisiting forums and chats. It was futile. The seller was gone. No accounts, no posts, nothing to trace. It was as if they'd erased themselves entirely, leaving me alone to carry the weight of what I'd done. As weeks passed, the paranoia only grew. Small, seemingly insignificant events took on sinister undertones. A package delivered to my door by mistake left me frozen in place, staring at it for hours before daring to open it. Calls from unknown numbers left my hands shaking, even though no one ever spoke. Each incident chipped away at my sanity until every shadow felt like a threat, every coincidence a warning. Months later, I left college and moved to a new city. Slowly, the nightmares began to fade. The constant feeling of being watched started to dissipate, replaced by a fragile sense of normalcy. But even now, the fear hasn't entirely gone away. I can't bring myself to use online forums or anything that reminds me of the dark web. What haunts me most isn't the email or the destroyed data. It's the unanswered questions. Who sent that email? Did the files survive somewhere? Do the people whose DNA I held even know what happened? These thoughts linger like shadows in the back of my mind, quiet but persistent. I've learned to live with them, not by choice, but because there's no other option. Some mistakes leave marks that never fade, and some doors, once open, can't be closed. The weight of that truth is mine to carry, and I doubt it will ever let me go. To this day, I wonder how things might have been different if I'd made another choice. What if I had gone to the police? Would they have helped me? Or would I have brought even more attention to myself, unraveling what little protection I had left? I'll never know. That uncertainty is part of the weight I carry, a reminder of the doors I opened that can never be closed. What I do know is that those days changed me, how I see science, ethics, and the internet itself. Before, I thought of the dark web as a curiosity, a hidden place full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Now I know it's much more than that. a labyrinth where the wrong turn can haunt you forever. The consequences aren't abstract. They're tangible, seeping into your life in ways you can't predict or control. I learned that the hard way. I'm not the same ambitious biology student I was back then, chasing recognition and breakthroughs. That version of me is long gone, replaced by someone who just wants to stay unnoticed. The thrill I once felt exploring the boundaries of knowledge has been replaced by an ever-present caution, a wariness that creeps into every corner of my life. If you're reading this and thinking about delving into the dark web, whether out of curiosity or for some personal project, please don't. It's not what you think it is. What seems like a shortcut, a hidden opportunity, can turn into a burden you'll carry forever. I thought I was in control, that I understood what I was doing. But the truth is, from the moment I clicked that first link, I was lost. The dark web doesn't care about your intentions. It takes what it wants, and it doesn't let go. Even now, years later, the shadows linger. I tell myself it's just paranoia, that the nightmares and fleeting anxieties are echoes of a mistake I've moved past. But then there are nights when I wake up to the faint creak of a floorboard or the rustle of wind outside my window. And for a moment, I'm back there, trapped in the paranoia, waiting for the knock on the door that never comes. A notification on my phone can still make my stomach drop, even though it's just a reminder or an email. At least, that's what I tell myself. The truth is, I'll never know for sure if it's really over. That's the price of the choices I made. Not knowing if the fear is mine alone, or if it's still out there, watching, waiting. And that's a price I wouldn't wish on anyone. I've always been a normal guy, or at least I thought so. Second year of business school, splitting a cramped apartment with 2 friends, juggling overdue assignments, and scraping by on a scholarship that barely covered the rent. My family helped when they could, but their support was stretched thin. I was desperate for a way out of the constant financial strain. And when you're desperate, even bad ideas start to look like good ones. That's how I ended up considering the dark web. It started with stories, whispers about people flipping items bought anonymously online and making a killing. It sounded like easy money. Not exactly legal, sure, but harmless enough. After a few late-night Google searches, I found myself diving into that shadowy corner of the internet. At first, it was overwhelming. Cryptic links, jargon I didn't understand. But after enough trial and error, I found him. A supplier with the username ChemGod666. His profile looked oddly professional, with detailed price lists, glowing reviews, and promises of quick, discreet delivery. After a few messages, I decided to take a chance. My first order was small, just a test run. 2 days later, a nondescript package showed up at my door. I resold the contents within hours and doubled my investment. The thrill of that quick success was intoxicating. Greed started to creep in. If a little works, I thought, why not go bigger? I scraped together every cent I could find and even borrowed money from a friend, lying about needing textbooks for school. This time, I contacted the supplier directly, confident that I was now one of his trusted clients. His reply was quick and polite, but there was a twist. For larger orders, he preferred in-person drop-offs. Safer for both of us, he said. I hesitated. Meeting face-to-face felt risky, but the lure of bigger profits silenced my doubts. The drop-off point was an alley behind an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, the kind of place that practically screamed bad idea. Still, I showed up at dusk, my backpack stuffed with cash. The air was cold and heavy with the metallic tang of the nearby factories. My heart pounded as I waited, every shadow and distant noise setting my nerves on edge. After a few minutes, they appeared. 2 men, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. One was scrawny, his face stretched into a grin that never reached his eyes. The other was massive, with tattooed arms and a permanent scowl. They didn't match the professionalism I'd expected from ChemGod 666. My stomach sank. The scrawny guy spoke first, his voice calm but unsettling. The backpack. It wasn't a request. I tried to keep my cool, asking about the product, as if I still had some control over the situation. The big guy didn't bother with words. He stepped forward, pulling a knife from his jacket. It wasn't huge, but it didn't need to be. The glint of the blade in the fading light made my chest tighten. The backpack. Now. I don't know if it was fear or stubbornness, but I refused, insisting I wouldn't hand over the money without seeing the goods. The response was immediate. The knife flashed, and a sharp pain seared through my arm. I staggered back, staring at the tear in my jacket and the blood starting to seep through. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could react, the scrawny guy lunged forward, yanking the backpack from my hands. The big guy reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I tried to resist, grabbing for it, but a hard shove sent me sprawling onto the cold pavement. They didn't look back. Their laughter echoed as they disappeared into the shadows, leaving me clutching my bleeding arm. I sat there for what felt like hours, the reality sinking in. It wasn't just the money I'd lost, or the physical pain from the knife. It was the humiliation, the crushing realization that I'd been so naive. I had thought I was in control, but control had been an illusion. Greed had blinded me to the danger, and now I was left with nothing but debt and fear. As I stumbled home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. What if they'd taken more than just my phone, my personal information, my address? Paranoia clung to me like a second skin, and the walls of my apartment, once a refuge, now felt like they were closing in. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my arm throbbing and my thoughts racing. I wasn't just broke, I was broken, and I had no one to blame but myself. After lying in that grimy alley for a few minutes, reality snapped back into focus. I needed to leave. Fast. The light was fading, and the place had already felt dangerous in daylight. Now, with the shadows stretching longer, every sound seemed sharper, more threatening. I tore the sleeve off my jacket, tied it tightly around my bleeding arm, and forced myself to move. Each step felt heavier, not just from exhaustion, but from the crushing weight of what had just happened. My legs trembled as adrenaline wore off, and every distant noise, footsteps, the rustle of trash in the wind, made me whip my head around, certain they were coming back to finish the job. The city felt alive with eyes, all of them on me, waiting for me to stumble. By the time I reached my apartment, my body felt like it would collapse under me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat, and stumbled inside. The silence of the empty apartment was a relief, though I still locked the door and slid the chain across for good measure. I dropped onto my bed without even taking off my shoes. My arm throbbed under the makeshift bandage, and my chest ached from shallow, panicked breaths. I stared up at the cracked ceiling, my mind replaying the scene over and over. The knife, the sneer, the laughter as they walked away with everything I had. Worst of all, they had my phone, my address. My life felt like it was now in their hands, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they, or someone connected to them, would show up at my door. Every possibility twisted through my mind. Retaliation, blackmail, worse. I lay there paralyzed, listening to every creak in the hallway outside, every car that passed on the street below. Each sound felt like a warning, a reminder that I wasn't safe. Sleep didn't come that night. I clutched the old phone I'd pulled out of a drawer, its battery half dead and screen cracked. But I didn't dare open any apps or log into my accounts. What if they could trace me? I didn't even know how any of this worked. But my imagination filled in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. The question gnawed at me. What if they showed up? My mind spiraled deeper with every passing hour. The days that followed were no better. I went through the motions. Classes, small talk with friends. But the fear followed me everywhere. The cut on my arm wasn't deep, but every time I caught sight of it, my stomach turned. It was a constant bleeding reminder of how badly I'd miscalculated. And then there were the strange things. A black car parked across the street seemed to always be there, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I never saw anyone get in or out, but its presence felt deliberate. Once, while walking home from class, I could swear someone was following me. Their footsteps echoed behind mine, too perfectly timed to be coincidence, but every time I looked over my shoulder, the street seemed empty. The paranoia consumed me. At night, I avoided the windows. Terrified, I'd see a silhouette staring back at me. The sounds of footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment became unbearable, each one an omen. One night, I was sure they stopped right at my door. My chest tightened as I stood frozen in the living room, clutching a cardboard tube like it could protect me. The silence stretched impossibly thin, my ears straining for the faintest sound. Finally, I worked up the courage to look through the peephole, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway staring back, mocking me. I couldn't decide if I was losing my mind or if someone was out there taunting me. Desperation pushed me to the police, but I couldn't tell them the truth. Instead, I made up a story about being mugged while walking home. The officer at the desk barely looked up from his paperwork as he took down my statement. "Don't carry so much cash," he said, like it was that simple. I left feeling more exposed than before. They couldn't help me. No one could. I blocked the SIM card from my stolen phone and deactivated my accounts, but the fear didn't go away. It had taken root, growing in every shadow and silence. I started avoiding my friends, keeping conversations short, afraid they'd see through me. How could I explain? I was too ashamed to admit what I'd done, too scared to trust anyone. Every interaction felt dangerous, like a crack in the mask I was trying to hold together. In those quiet moments, alone with my thoughts, I realized the truth. I wasn't afraid of the supplier or the thugs I'd met in the alley. I was afraid of myself, of the choices I'd made, and the trap I'd walked into willingly. No amount of locked doors or false smiles could undo the fact that I had gambled with my life, and I'd lost. As the days passed, the paranoia only tightened its grip. I stopped going out whenever I could avoid it, but staying locked in my apartment didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. Being trapped within four walls gave my thoughts room to fester. feeding the fear. Every knock at the door or buzz from the intercom sent a jolt through me, and I'd sit frozen, barely breathing, until the silence returned. But what pushed me over the edge was what I started noticing inside my own home. One night, I got up to grab a glass of water and saw the kitchen window slightly open. I froze. I was certain I'd locked it earlier. My pulse hammered as I checked every corner of the apartment, the dim light casting long, eerie shadows. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but the unease wouldn't leave me. Had someone been here? Were they sending me a message? The thought of someone slipping into my apartment and leaving without a trace haunted me for days. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the creak of a neighbor's footsteps, felt like it was meant for me, like I was being watched from some unseen corner. Speculation became my new reality, each detail fitting into a macabre puzzle of my own making. I couldn't live like this anymore. Desperate, I turned to the only person I trusted enough to confide in, the friend I'd borrowed money from. I told him everything, laying out the mess I'd created. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable until I finished. Then he said something that hit harder than I expected. "Man, you've got to get out of this. Forget the money. Forget these people. If you don't, you won't last long." His words stuck with me because they were true. I couldn't keep living like this. That conversation was a turning point. I decided to sever every tie with what remained of that world. I uninstalled the browser I'd used to access the dark web, wiped all related files from my laptop, and swore to myself I'd never go back. It felt symbolic, a way to claw back some sense of control. But it didn't end there. I changed my routines, avoiding the places I used to frequent, and even took a different route to college each day, zigzagging through side streets to make it harder for anyone to follow me. It felt like I was running from ghosts, something that might not even have been chasing me anymore. But the fear refused to let go. At night, the sense of being watched lingered. I'd sit in bed, staring at the door, feeling the weight of invisible eyes. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking, and the faintest creak of the building sent my heart racing. Once, I thought I heard faint breathing outside my window, but when I worked up the courage to check, there was nothing there. The rational part of me told me it was all in my head. The other part wasn't so sure. Gradually, things began to settle. The black car that had parked across the street disappeared, and the strange noises in the building grew less frequent. My routine started to feel normal again, but the scars from that experience didn't fade. They weren't just on my arm. They were deeper, buried in the way I saw the world now. I wasn't the same person anymore. I'd learned that greed and shortcuts come with a price, and sometimes that price is far higher than you ever imagined. To this day, I don't know if I was truly in danger, or if my mind had created an enemy out of shadows. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that I've never gone near the dark web again, and every time I see a story about scams or crimes tied to it, I feel a chill run down my spine. I got off easy, I think. An empty bank account, a slashed arm, and paranoia that eventually faded. But the fear, the memory of how close I came to something worse, that stayed. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint noises in the distance and wonder if they mean anything. Maybe it's just the wind, or a neighbor's television. Or maybe, somewhere out there, the past is still waiting for me, just a few clicks away. I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but I can't keep it to myself. It's about my best friend, someone I've known since school. Even after life took us in different directions, we stayed close, always finding time to meet or exchange messages. She was 27, working as a night security guard at a factory in the city's industrial zone. She hated the job, always complaining about how creepy it felt at night. But it paid the bills, and she didn't have many other options. I thought the worst thing she had to deal with was boredom, or the occasional thief trying to steal scrap metal. I never imagined she'd end up like that. A couple of days before she disappeared, she sent me a video on WhatsApp that I'll never forget. It was short, shaky footage, taken with her phone, showing a trailer parked behind the factory. The camera wobbled as she whispered, breathless, "This can't be real." The trailer's doors were open, and inside were huge black trash bags. But they weren't filled with trash. She zoomed in on one that had torn, and I swear to God, you could see what looked like a human arm. It was pale, mottled with purplish blotches, like it had been dead for days. I immediately messaged her, asking what the hell was going on. Her reply chilled me. "I'll explain later. This is way bigger than I thought." That was the last message I ever got from her. The next morning, I tried contacting her again. Messages, calls, everything. Nothing. At first, I thought maybe she'd gotten busy, or her phone had died. But as the day went on, the silence grew louder, and my worry turned into dread. By late afternoon, I decided to check the factory. When I got there, the guard on duty wasn't her. It was some guy I'd never seen before. He told me her shift had ended the night before, and she hadn't shown up since. Something was wrong. I could feel it. That night, I got the call. Someone found something strange at a storage site a few kilometers from the factory. My heart nearly stopped when they said it was a body. But it wasn't just a body. It was her body, folded up inside a suitcase like she was nothing more than an object. I can still feel the cold, sick weight of that moment. The shock was paralyzing. How could someone do something like that? Worse, the police barely said anything about the case. Just a vague statement and nothing else. It felt like they were trying to bury it, suppress any attention. I couldn't accept it. I couldn't just let it end there. I started digging, talking to her co-workers, neighbors, anyone who might have answers. Most didn't know anything, but one co-worker who worked the same shift told me something that made my skin crawl. He said she had been unusually restless that night, like she was on edge, expecting something bad to happen. Later, after her shift should have ended, he noticed headlights moving in the parking lot, but he didn't think much of it at the time. No one else saw anything. And the video she sent me? It was gone from her phone, completely wiped, as if it had never existed. I couldn't let it go. I started searching the internet, looking for anything that could make sense of what had happened. What I found was like falling into a nightmare. On forums and obscure threads, people talked about criminal networks, human trafficking, and even darker things tied to the dark web. One recurring theme was the use of abandoned factories as exchange points, places where bodies were transported as commodities. And it wasn't just bodies. There were whispers about missing children, organ harvesting, and other horrors I can't bring myself to repeat. At first, it all seemed too surreal, like something out of a twisted movie. But then I thought about the suitcase, the trailer, the video that had vanished. It all fit. And the idea that my best friend had stumbled into something far bigger than a random crime wasn't just terrifying, it felt inevitable. The more I dug into what happened, the clearer it became that my best friend had stumbled onto something massive. The trailer behind the factory seemed to be the key, but the deeper I searched, the less sense everything made. No nearby security cameras had recorded the trailer, and the only concrete proof, the video she sent me, was gone without a trace. Frustrated and desperate, I went to the police with what little I had. Their reaction left me cold. They listened, but it felt performative, like they already knew more than they were willing to share. One of the investigators even pulled me aside and muttered, "It's better if you stay away from this. It won't change anything." That only fueled my obsession. I started combing through deep web forums, despite knowing how dangerous it was. It didn't take long to find threads echoing what I'd seen. Stories of people disappearing after stumbling across suspicious transports, trailers, or shipping containers that didn't belong. Some accounts were chillingly specific: bodies sold for experiments, human trafficking operations, even darker theories I don't dare put into words. One user, who seemed disturbingly well-informed, left a comment that haunts me to this day. Anyone who sees and talks about this doesn't last long. After reading that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I told myself it was just paranoia, but strange things started happening. My phone froze for no reason, and I'd sometimes hear faint clicking noises on the line, like someone was recording my calls. One night, a black car parked in front of my house for nearly half an hour. The windows were tinted, and I couldn't see who was inside. When I stepped out to get a closer look and write down the license plate, the car sped off, disappearing into the night. That was the moment I realized I was in over my head. What crushed me most was realizing I no longer had proof of anything. The video was gone. The factory changed ownership weeks after her disappearance, and no one I contacted, her co-workers, neighbors, even mutual friends, would talk to me anymore. They either didn't know anything, or they were too scared to say it. The forums I had been using as a lifeline started vanishing too. Threads I had bookmarked were suddenly wiped clean, accounts deleted, as if someone was systematically erasing every trace of what I'd found. Still, her case consumed me. I couldn't let go. I knew what I'd seen in that video. I knew what they'd done to her. But the more the trail faded, the more obvious it became that I was up against something far bigger than me. Something that didn't want to be found. Weeks turned into months, and eventually, I had to accept that I'd never get answers. The helplessness gnawed at me. She wasn't the kind of person who sought out trouble. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I tried to move on, but it always felt like something unfinished, like a part of me was trapped in that nightmare. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights, I decided to delete everything I had. Notes, screenshots, anything tied to her case. It was eating me alive, and I thought letting it go might help. As I was clearing my files, I noticed something I'd missed before. One of the screenshots from the video showed a detail I hadn't paid attention to. A strange symbol painted on the side of the trailer. It was subtle, almost faded, but unmistakable. A triangle with a circle cut in half, almost like a logo. That symbol became my new obsession. I spent days researching it, scouring the web for any connection. Theories surfaced, scattered and incomplete. Some said it was a mark used by a human trafficking network tied to the dark web. Others claimed it was a seal for special transports, the kind carrying things that could never see the light of day. Whether it was tied to her death or just another piece of the puzzle, I couldn't say. But it was the last thing I uncovered before I forced myself to stop. Walking away wasn't easy, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. To this day, I avoid speaking about what happened. Not because I've forgotten or stopped caring, but because I can't shake the feeling that someone's still listening. Maybe I'm just paranoid, or maybe I'm right. Either way, I've learned one thing. Some doors are better left unopened, because once you see what's on the other side, it might never stop watching you.